Hello listeners, and welcome to another episode of Bad Beat Interviews, where we dive deep into the issues shaping our world, from political upheavals to the silent battles fought in the shadows of power. Today we're beyond excited to bring you a conversation that promises to be both enlightening and provocative, as we sit down with none other than Matt Kennard. For those of you who might not be familiar, Matt Kennard is a tour de force in the realm of investigative journalism. He's the head of investigations at Declassified UK and has previously lent his expertise to outlets like the Financial Times and the Centre for Investigative Journalism in London. His fearless pursuits have taken him into the depths of global imperialism, exposing the mechanisms of power that often prefer to operate unseen. Matt's work is a beacon for those who believe in the power of truth to challenge the status quo. His latest book, The Record, is a stark revelation of how the American empire operates, pulling back the curtain on the corporate and governmental collusions that dictate much of the global political landscape. It's a must-read for anyone who dares to confront the realities of our time. Beyond the pages of his investigations, Matt has been a vocal critic of the ongoing injustices in Palestine. His unflinching coverage of the genocide has stirred both awareness and controversy, highlighting the dire need for a more profound and honest conversation about the role of Western powers in global conflicts. But what makes Matt's voice particularly compelling is not just his incisive critique of imperialism or his dedication to uncovering uncomfortable truths. It's also his grounded, approachable demeanor. He has a way of articulating complex issues in terms that resonate with anyone who listens, making the intricate web of global politics accessible to all. Today we're not just delving into the dark corners of global politics, but also exploring rays of hope. How can we, as ordinary citizens, contribute to a movement for change? Is there a way to channel our collective outrage into constructive action? These are some of the questions we'll be unpacking with Matt. So whether you're a long-time follower of Matt Kennard's work or just tuning in for a dose of real talk, today's episode is guaranteed to challenge your perceptions and maybe, just maybe, inspire you to be part of the change we all wish to see in the world. Welcome, Matt.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So finally, you're coming on. We're trying to get a hold of you for quite a while.
Yeah.
We're big fans, Peter and I. Unfortunately, he could not come because Peter has some duties to attend to for our university, but he was pretty frustrated about it. So I hope in the future maybe we can get you on again, and Peter can be there.
Yeah, I'm up for coming on again. I'm sorry. I apologize for the difficulties of getting hold of me. There's been a lot going on, but it's good to be here. And I'll do it again.
Worries. No worries. We're just a small potato, and you have a lot of things going on. So we totally understand. Matt, let's just jump right into it. I want to talk to you a bit about the things that are going on today in our world, and especially about what's happening with the genocide and in general U.S. imperialism, or Western and also European imperialism, of course.
Yeah.
And I think we can all agree that we are living in a mask-off moment right now for the West. Many of us have lived under the assumption that we inhabit a world guided by human rights, with conflicts being exceptions to the rule, you could say. And most people, I think, were unaware of the deep involvement of the West in imperialism, especially after the end of territorial colonialism, which really speaks volumes about the West's exceptional ability to shape narratives that serve its interests. So in a way, I always say, Matt, that we are mentally colonized, as people in the West, but also around the world. And the current situation, you could say, in Palestine has really burst that bubble, revealing the stark realities hidden beneath the surface level narratives that we are fed. So Matt, you were one of the few who actually saw through this pretty early on. And I think you and I've heard your interviews, and I think you and I have went through comparable trajectories. I started university in 2003. This was during the war in Iraq, which really was you can almost say an existential crisis, which really changed my view. And of course, I also read Noam Chomsky back in the day, especially the book Who Rules the World. That was for me an eye-opener. My question to you, Matt, before I ramble on too long, how did you break out of that propaganda stranglehold and come to see the West for what it really is? And also, what drove you to expose these truths so relentlessly?
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with everything you just said. I think that we are living in a unprecedented time, really, because the system that operates and the US empire, and as you mentioned, its allies, they operate an empire, but it's hidden and silent and sustained through just reams of ideology and myths. And what we've seen in Gaza over the past year has absolutely exploded all of them because we've had access to the crimes that are being committed thanks to the heroic journalists in Gaza. Over 180 of them have now been killed and killed for their work as well, not just killed in the genocide. They've been killed because they are telling the world what is happening. And at the same time, you've had all the leaders in the West, or nearly all the leaders in the West, getting up and defending it all, regurgitating the propaganda, sending more arms, sending more spies, sending more logistical equipment. And people, the younger generation has literally had their eyes opened for the first time, and the older generation too. Because as you say, this is such a heavily curated empire in terms of its the ideology that we're fed, and from a young age, we're constantly told it's about freedom and democracy and human rights, and it's really a fairy tale, but it's very, very, very woven into the fabric of our society. And it goes through the media, it goes through the think tanks, it goes through the institutes, it goes through the educational institutions, curriculums, everything. So it's very, very hard to escape that when you're coming up, which is why it's so potent, But I think that it's crumbling to pieces now. And it has ever been thus. That's the important point is that the empire's always been, well, since the Second World War, when the US really took over, but obviously the British before that was brutal and savage as well. But the US empire has always been absolutely savage and has no regard for human life. If you look at what they did in Korea, for example, in the 50s, then Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they killed millions of people. In Cambodia and Laos, particularly in the secret wars that they fought there, in Cambodia, 500,000 people were killed in a short bombing campaign that the US public weren't even aware of. So, and then you had Iraq. So all this it goes in a long line, but I think that unfortunately for the empire, unfortunately for us, I think the Israeli colony that they've got in the Middle East is much more blatant about it. They don't speak to the ideology or the pieties that you're meant to in Western capitals. So in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, they weren't saying what they were doing publicly, and in fact, a lot of it was done in secret. In Iraq, even the propaganda of Bush and Blair was we want to take freedom and democracy. Whereas now you have like the Israeli officials getting up, and Yoav Gallant, who's just had an ICC arrest warrant issued for him, when he was defense minister early on in the genocide, he went on TV straight away after October 7th and said, we're dealing with human animals and we're going to withdraw all water and electricity from 2.3 million people, including half of them children. So they haven't played by the rules in that sense, and they've exposed the whole West because the West has then supported them. So we live in unprecedented times. Hopefully, it won't go back to how it was, but we need to understand, and I think critics of this system and critics of imperialism need to understand that there's a lot of different assets that the empire has, well, endless assets throughout the whole of the intellectual industries and media and all that kind of stuff, that will try and close that awakening when this horror eventually ends. And we need to make sure that people understand how the world works now, but that carries on when they're bombarded with all the propaganda again, because there's an opening now and we have to use it. So, sorry, I just did say that initially, but to go to your question about how I had an awakening. So my parents are quite political, but I wasn't that political when I was young because my dad's an artist and I was very much into art. So that was my obsession. And then like you, the war in Iraq really just transformed me because I saw my own government lying blatantly to its people, and not lying about something inconsequential, or lying about the most important thing a state can do, which is launch a war of aggression. They lied about the intelligence. They lied about their own history with Saddam Hussein, because obviously the Brits actually supported him at one time, including after the Halabja gas attack in 1988, by the way. So that, I just thought, wow, well, this goes against everything I've been told. And then started looking, as you, started reading Chomsky, who is kind of like the doyen of deconstructing all this stuff, and has been since the Vietnam War. And then realized, actually, it's not just Iraq they're lying about. They lie about the whole edifice, essentially. And the whole edifice rests on myths and lies. And then it was quite... it wasn't even a decision I made consciously, but it was quite a natural progression to then think, how can I work in my life to try and deconstruct these lies? Because they're not, these lies are what the whole system is sustained on. There's nothing that the empire fears more than the truth about its operations getting out. And you see that when people like Julian Assange really reveal the truth. They put him in prison for 5 years in the UK. And before that, in an embassy for nearly a decade as well. So I thought, well, as a good way of deconstructing this and trying to inform the public of what's going on is journalism, right? And not just columns, but I started to get into investigative journalism and revealing new truths. And interestingly, you're told that that's what journalism is for. Again, it's one of the myths that feeds into this whole imperial system, is that we have a journalistic infrastructure which holds power to account. And then soon after I left university and started working in mainstream media, I realized that was a myth as well. And actually, if you want to take on the tenets and the core myths of the empire and work in the mainstream media, basically you can't do that. And that was, again, quite a revelation to me. I know that it came later, but I actually did hold some myths inside me about the media role, because I got a job at the Financial Times, for example, which you would think wouldn't happen. So I was like, okay, well, maybe it's not completely closed. But then I realized once you're inside that all the teachings and all the analysis and all the research from Manufacturing Consent, which is the book by Chomsky and Herman about the political economy of the mass media, was essentially correct as well. You know, it doesn't work like it does in the Soviet Union, where you basically told what to write, and if you don't write the right things, you'll go to prison. It's a much more sophisticated way of ideological training, but essentially the effect is the same. That you can't get certain truths about the system, truths that might impinge on their ability to project power. You can't get them in the mainstream media. So then soon after that, I left the Financial Times and worked in independent media. And the interesting thing is that obviously there's a bargain you make at that stage, where when I was at the FT in Washington, I knew stories I was writing were being read by the president, for example, which is quite an exhilarating feeling. But then you realize actually it's not exhilarating, and there's nothing good about it, because you can't write the truth. So so you get millions of readers, you get readers in power centers, but you're not writing truth. So I left and then have worked basically in independent media since then, where obviously you're not getting read by power centers and you're not getting read by millions of people, but you can tell the truth. And really that's what's important in life, really. And for me personally, and I think for most people, that you have to be working or doing work, if you're a journalist, in line with basic principles about revealing truths and being able to tell the truth. So it was never really sometimes people say, well, you gave up all that mainstream career, but it was never an option. I would not have whatever situation happened, I wouldn't have lasted long, because I would have butted up against the fact that I couldn't say what I want. And that's what I wanted to be a journalist for. So, but again, like I said with the Gaza thing, I think that the independent media space is super exciting for people who want to challenge the myth making in the imperial centers, because again, they've held power over the means of intellectual production for centuries. The businessmen owned the printing presses, they owned all the newspaper, and there was no technology really to bypass that. Obviously, you could publish and some pamphlets like Thomas Paine would reach millions of people at different times, but there wasn't an infrastructure. And now we have social media, we have the internet. Obviously, there's pitfalls for that as well, but there is definitely a way of getting word out now and getting truths out and exposing the empire, which didn't exist before. And so we at Declassified, which we founded in 2018, we wouldn't exist without the internet and without social media. So there are a lot of promising things. So yeah, amidst all the horror of the world, and there is a lot of horror, especially in Gaza, there are shoots of hope, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I recognize a lot of things that you say. Yeah, I remember writing myself for a relatively liberal outlet in the Netherlands, a bit comparable to the Guardian, you could say.
Mm,
And I remember sometimes having articles that go viral. In a small country of the Netherlands, 300,000 readers would be immense, you know. So
mm,
that would, like you say, that was very exhilarating. But
mm.
what started to frustrate me in that sense, because I'm really direct in my writings, is of course the editors who started cutting things out or say you cannot
Mm.
say this, and
Yeah,
that's so incredibly frustrating. So I can imagine when you're doing investigative journalism, it's even more frustrating. And the same
yes,
in
for sure.
academia. Same in
Yeah.
academia. Same in academia. You know, I now work here as a professor in Hong Kong, and I can tell you the things that I can discuss here in a non-Western society is in my field when it comes to imperialism and all that kind of stuff is actually more than I could
Mm.
say in Western Europe. You know what I mean?
Interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting, isn't it? It's like
Yeah.
again, is a myth that we're told, and the
Yep.
reality is very, very different.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like some people say that about Americans, and I think it's about Europeans too, that we are one of the most propagandized people in the world. We are
Yeah,
actually unfree people who are convinced we are the freest people in the world. It's
yeah.
really baffling.
Yeah, which is why the propaganda system is so beautiful and elegant here because you're much better at spreading propaganda and believing propaganda if you don't believe you're doing it. Like in the Soviet Union, people were aware that what they were doing was spreading propaganda, but
Hmm.
and obviously they don't believe in it in the same way. You believe in something like the myths that we project much more if you think you're doing it off your own back, and that's why it's beautiful in a way. But and it's quite funny when you talk to mainstream journalists in the UK. I'm sure it goes for other places. They're always at pains to say, "I can write what I want. I can say what I want." Always, and I laugh at them, and I'm
Yep.
thinking, well, yeah, you can say what you want because they like what you say. And you know, like that. There's a famous actually interview that Andrew Marr, who was a very senior BBC journalist, and he interviewed Noam Chomsky once,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that clip's gone viral. And he's very upset with what Chomsky said about the media and propaganda. And he says, "What are you saying? I don't believe what I believe." And he says, "No, I'm sure you believe what you believe, but you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting if you believe something different." And that's exactly how it works. It's a filtering system where
Yep.
people who accept the myths, accept the assumptions, accept the presuppositions of the state just rise, and anyone who doesn't is filtered out and kicked out. And most people, funnily
Hmm.
enough, become culturalized to the institutions. There's not many, and unless you've got a really strong will, and I saw this at the FT, you have to have a really, really strong will, and not really care about your career to be able to resist it, because otherwise, you know, you're going to be out of a job, and a lot of people are fearful of that. So they slowly become part of the institutionalized thinking, and that's how it works, I think.
Yeah, and it's incredibly powerful. I mean, many people want to have food on the table for their children, and you name it.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
you see people who come from former colonies who are now rabid Zionists. I mean, it's
Yes, I
so
know.
so incredibly powerful and painful to
Yeah.
see as well, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. It
So
is.
so so Matt, you argue that the UK and the US, and I would say many other European countries as well, are pursuing their geopolitical interests worldwide. Um, my question is, when we talk about modern imperialism and what we see today, what do you see as the core driving forces behind this modern UK, US, but I would say also NATO in general imperialism?
Yeah, there's two sides to it. One is geopolitical control, and one is profit making, essentially, and corporate control. And like so. so NATO, well, and obviously they're linked because often geopolitical, if they control a country, that country more often than not will be opening its economy up on the terms that the West wants. So what they and this is what the book I published recently, the second edition of The Racket, is based on a speech by a guy called General Smedley Butler, who died the most decorated Marine in U.S. history. And he made this speech um, uh, later on in life, but he was like a senior member of the Marines that fought. He fought in all the imperial wars in Central America, in China actually during the Boxer Rebellion, and other places. And but then he had an awakening when he left, and he made this speech, I think, in 1933, where he said, everything I was told about why I was fighting in the Marines was a lie. It wasn't for the national security interests of the United States. It wasn't for my people's freedom. It was about ensuring the bottom line of Brown Brothers Bank in New York and other corporations in those countries. And he said that what he was is a high class muscle man for big business. And I think that is essentially correct. It is that the whole system is effectively run to ensure that profit making and corporate power is ensured around the world. What's often called neoliberalism, but and there's different elements to that system, right? So they don't actually like war, and they don't like using the Marines, like Smedley Butler, as the primary mechanism. They would much rather control the world and make it work in the interests of US and allied corporate power through just having these kind of client states that have the patina of democracy. And then if someone like Salvador Allende comes into power, unfortunately the system stops working and Allende wins an election. You use intelligence, subversion. In the end, they use a military coup in that respect, but you use other organizations like the Drug Enforcement Administration, USAID, National Endowment for Democracy. There's a whole infrastructure to make sure democracy,
or even the UN.
yeah, the UN, exactly. There's a whole tapestry. And the ICC was part of that imperial tapestry until yesterday. That was the first time a Western leader has been issued within a Western one. But so they have this whole infrastructure in place that's obviously not presented in the way I've just described. They present it under using terms like democracy, National Endowment for Democracy, US aid. There's many different elements, and it gives the impression that democracy people can vote for what they want when they can't. And if they bring in someone, and there's a lot of different ways of making sure people don't ever vote for someone who uses the resources of their country for their own people. That's the red line for the empire, right? But then sometimes it doesn't work. It's not a perfect system. And then someone like Evo Morales in Bolivia can get elected and nationalize loads of assets. And then when they do that, then you have to bring in the subversion, like trying to get the opposition east to cede from the country, do a massive strike by the truck workers, so nothing moves. If that doesn't work, then you can bring in the military. In fact, Bolivia is an interesting example because nothing worked from 2006 to 2019.
Heavy sanctions as well.
Sanctions, that's a huge one now, which is war by another means. They say quarter of the human population on Earth is living under US sanctions now, or either directly or indirectly. So yeah, there's many different mechanisms. And then if they can't budge you, if they can't make that society work in your interests, they'll bring in the military and they'll do an invasion. I mean, what is often called in kind of academic literature is an open door empire, whereby it's all about economic penetration, and if you allow economic penetration, the US will not. They don't make you become part of the US, but you're effectively a client state, and you have to stay in that position. Otherwise, they'll come in and take you out. And it happened. Haiti's another example. You know, Haiti in 2004, John Bertrand Aristide, who was the first democratically elected leader of Haiti in its history, who was taken out in 2 coups, but the one in 2004, which was under the Bush administration, he was literally walked to the plane by the US ambassador, sent to the Central African Republic. His party was banned, Lavalas, which is still banned, and Haiti was just reintegrated into the US imperial system. and destroyed effectively because it was never allowed to have an independent government, a sovereign government. That's what they don't want. They don't want an independent nationalist government. And Henry Kissinger once called it a virus that could spread if that was allowed to succeed. And that's why it's so important, because if we want a country, a world which is run in the interests of its people, the presupposition to that, the assumption it has to be based on, is that governments control the resources and the levers of power in that country, and that's exactly what the United States don't want. But then also, it's an imperial system where the US is by far the most powerful. But I mean, everyone's playing it. The great powers, that they're not. They used to call it the Great Game. That's what's going on. And I think that the US is just a much more militaristic in the way it runs. If you look at the how its military footprint, I mean, it's got 11 carrier battle groups, which are these huge groups of ships and planes that can literally be deployed anywhere in the world. They cost billions. It's got 800 bases around the world that we know about. It's got US military personnel in 132 of the 190 UN member states. It's everywhere militarily. It's got 12,000 troops in the country I'm in now, which is the UK, which no one ever talks about. And China, by contrast, has one overseas military base in Djibouti. And the US and hasn't invaded anyone. And the US at the same sort of time in its rise to superpower status was not like that. It was not like that. And I get in trouble a lot just pointing that out, but that's just a fact. Whether that doesn't, you can make your own consequential assumptions about what that means about China's role in the world or its power, but that is just a fact. I think China's got a different model for its foreign relations.
Different culture also, very different culture.
Very different culture, exactly. And they're not a settler colony in the same way. The United States is a settler colony, and it's always been an empire. That's the other important thing. If you look at, it was the first settlement, British settlement in the Americas was in 1607 in Jamestown, and ever since then they were expanding westward, taking land from the Native Americans, basically tricking them. Getting them to sign treaties, massacring them, depopulating their areas. And then the internal frontier closed in 1890. And then the Spanish-American War happened in 1898. And that's when they took on a load of they won that war and took on a load of Spanish imperial possessions. And then they've been expanding ever since overseas. So the US just has this mentality of it's always been an empire. The world is theirs, effectively. You know, they used to call it manifest destiny. Domestically, and it was all based on the idea that God had given them this land. It's a bit like Zionism, and it was also this kind of idea of the city upon a hill. They were taking these universal principles of noble principles to the Americas and civilizing the savages. And the same mentality goes for their overseas empire. You know, now like it's all couched in this phraseology about democracy, freedom, human rights, which is not a motivator. To go to your question again, it's not a motivator at all. Sorry, I'm just going to put that there so the light doesn't. It's not about that. Like the myths that they tell themselves about why they're in these places and why they operate an empire, or even that an empire exists, is all rubbish. But it has a long history. And for me, I think that the great hope for humanity is a multipolar world. You know, which we're seeing the development of. And that's not to say that I think that China's going around the world for altruistic reasons. I don't. I think that it obviously wants to spread its power and spread its corporate interests and whatever it is, or geopolitical interests. But it has a different way of going about it. And also, the other important point is, since the end of the Cold War, or until kind of 2010s, really, when China really became an issue for the West. Like they had complete control. It was resurgent capitalism, resurgent US imperialism, and there was no check on it. And it's very hard for independent governments to organize and survive in that environment. You had that Zapatista uprising in 1994 in Mexico. You had Chavez in 1998. But they were few and far between, the left victories. And also Chavez nearly got taken out in the 2002 coup by backed by the CIA. But Nowadays, it's harder for them to do that because there's an infrastructure those countries can bring in from China, Russia, to defend their political system against these attacks from the United States. You saw it in Venezuela under Maduro. You know, like there was under Trump, during the Trump administration, he appointed Elliot Abrams, the criminal from the Iran Contra affair, and just one of the most
Brutal.
brutal and sadistic people in Washington. He brought him in to be the envoy for Venezuela, for effectively for regime change, although they didn't call it that. Within 3 months of him appointing Elliot Abrams, Leopoldo Lopez and Juan Guaido launched an armed uprising on the streets of Caracas. They had soldiers with them, guns, and it was put down. And then there was an invasion, but you know they call it the Bay of Piglets. It was like so, but they survived. Maduro is still in power, and they've got the largest proven oil reserves in the world, or maybe the largest proven oil reserves. So they survived, but they could bring in the Chinese and the Russians to set off that. So the multipolar world is something we should really hope for, and is a promising progression. I hope it continues.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also that's one of the reasons why China is often portrayed as the biggest threat of mankind. I mean, I don't think it's I think for a large part it's even because China is also spending its resources a lot on its own people. And I think that new model is very, very threatening to all these capitalists.
Yeah. Well, China from 1980 to now, they did the biggest poverty reduction program in human history. They took 800 million people, as you know this, 800 million people out of poverty, extreme poverty. Anyone who was interested in actually getting rid of poverty, which is what we're told the IMF and the World Bank is for, that's their mandate actually, would look at what did China do. They don't do that, of course, but yes, as you said, I totally agree with that. I think that they're terrified of people actually opening their eyes in a open-minded way to what China has done and how they achieved that, and seeing that it contradicts all the stuff we're told about neoliberalism being the right development model. You have to privatize everything. Obviously, there's a private sector in China, but that was done mainly through state intervention. That poverty reduction program, which is hugely worrying, and also, as you say, that is why China's not the threat. The threat is the Western Empire. China's not the threat. But it has to be presented as a threat because it is a threat to the ability of the US and allies empire ability to run roughshod all over the world. That is true. It is a threat to that. But it's not a threat to us as citizens of the world. In fact, I think that the rise to power of China is a great hope because it gives space to independent governments. I think more people are realizing this. Again, it's hard to get anything that we've said into the mainstream media, but people have looked at the world and looked at what their governments are doing for them and looked at what their governments are doing for Israel and seeing, well, all this stuff I'm being told about Putin and Xi Jinping, is that not us? Is that it's kind of like every accusation is a confession. They basically are coming to terms with the fact that the international system is a mafia system, and we do whatever we want. And all the nice theories that we're told about international law, international justice, how our military operates, it's all gone. It's all gone, and it's exploded alongside all the buildings in Gaza.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny that you say that. I remember writing an article calling it the Mafia Empire, the United States. And I remember that article was, of course, not published in the Netherlands, but eventually I put it on my own Substack.
Yeah.
But it is indeed, what can I say? China is in that sense very different from the Western mindset, you could say. But let's see how that develops. I agree that it's a glimmer of hope. The whole propaganda against China is also not working that well, I must say, as back in the day with the Muslims. Muslims is an ancient racism that you could rile up all the time for all these interventions in the Middle East, or I should say West Asia. And look at how many countries have been destroyed by Western imperialism, and people just took it. People just accepted it. And not only that, imperialism has also harmed minority groups within the West, psychologically, but also physically, to such an extent because of imperialism. I mean, even myself, I'm a mixed guy. I have an Algerian dad, Dutch mom, but even I just felt the heavy racism that exploded after 9/11. It was
Yeah.
really undoable to live in a society like the Netherlands, and probably in the UK it's very comparable. And they're trying to do the same right now, you could say, with China. China, the biggest threat, and all the yellow peril and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But it's not working that well anymore. And
No.
in fact, even Islamophobia is not really working that well anymore because of what we are seeing in Gaza and all that kind of stuff. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit to that right now, Matt, to jump a bit to Gaza. I always ask this question to all my guests, and everybody actually has a different answer. So it's very interesting, And these are many people who focus on this kind of stuff. What, in your assessment, explains the blatant and unquestioning support of most Western governments for the ongoing genocide in Gaza, which has been unfolding for over a year now? All of its horrors have been directly streamed to our screens. We can see it on phone, on X, Twitter, you name it. And to be honest, this is unprecedented. And for me personally, I call it a reality-shattering moment. I was already pessimistic about the West since 9/11 and that war on terror. I was already pessimistic. But even to me, seeing what our societies do is shocking. And I was already somebody who focused on things like imperialism. So you could say this moment destroys pretty much everything that we all thought was true about the way our societies work. European governments seem more willing to beat up and imprison their own citizens than to stop Israel from committing mass murder in West Asia. So in your opinion, Matt, what explains this steadfast support?
Well, it's a question that I get a lot, and I'm sure you get asked a lot. I think there's two arguments, right? Which is that Israel is just a Western colony in West Asia, and it's much easier for them to project power in that region if they have this little colony that they can base troops there, but they can also keep the Arab world in check. And the other one is that our political systems have been captured by the Israel lobby. And I used to believe the first one. I used to think that, and there is obviously a long history of evidence of the fact that like Israel was even created because it was explicitly about projecting British imperial power. So, for example, the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which was when the British government basically gave away Palestine to the Zionist movement, when they said we agree with the creation of a Jewish state. Soon after, the former governor of Jerusalem, I think his name was Ronald Storrs, he was asked, why did the British support the Zionist movement? And he said, we want a little Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. So Ulster is Northern Ireland. So the idea was we'd create a little Jewish Ulster in the Middle East where we might lose control of the Arab world. And it would be much easier to keep that world under imperial control if we have this little Jewish Ulster. And that's why we supported it. That's why the United States took over the role. And I think that is probably, there's elements of that that's true, but I have to say all the work I've done at Declassified about the Israel lobby's role here, I believe that that is the much more important element now. That actually our political systems are captured in many ways by the Israel lobby, and it's quite evident. Is it all right with the? I'll just stop so you can cut. Is it all right with the sun, or is it?
I'm not too bothered by it, but if you're bothered by it, you can.
I'll start that again. For me, the Israel lobby is the major factor for why there's such conformity of thought across the political system in the UK and the US, and probably in Europe as well. I haven't looked into it so much on the Israel question, because it's not in their interests in many ways to continue supporting this. As you said, the awakening that you've gone through, and me too, awakening. We already had an awakening about what Western power was, but we didn't think it could be so nakedly exposed as this. It's having a huge impact on millions of people around the world. It's shattering all their myths, and they're also having to smash the system that they created after the Second World War to get it done. Like even the ICC now, ICC is part of the imperial tapestry, and now you're having to have the United States come out and say that they're going to they already had the Hague Invasion Act, but they're now saying that they're going to that there was a congressional resolution to sanction Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor, and his family. And
I'm gonna pause you for a moment. Now you're almost disappearing from the screen.
Yeah.
So
okay. So now you have the United States Congress passing resolutions to sanction Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor at the ICC, and his family. You have the British government refusing to say today, actually, whether they'd even enforce the arrest warrant for Karim Khan. We're a signatory to the ICC and the Rome Statute. So they're having to literally smash up the system that they've used to impose power on the world to get this done. So we are in new territory. And I think that it's only explained by the fact that they can't move within the halls of power here and in the United States against Israel. And you see that there's lots and lots of different institutions that compose this control. The main ones, or the ones that we know most about, are like Labour Friends of Israel and Conservative Friends of Israel in the UK. What they don't reveal their funders, but you can guess who they are. But they cultivate politicians young in their career. Soon after they enter parliament, send them on propaganda tours of Israel. They then do lots of events and get these people to become members. And basically, they are Israel lobby groups. They're very, very linked to the embassy in London. And then the other side of it is the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And a lot of the groups now, which you see in the UK, and this is in the United States too, and probably in Europe, I haven't looked into it too much, but they present themselves as organizations for combating anti-Semitism.
yeah,
but actually they're nothing to do with combating anti-Semitism
or even combating hate and racism in general.
No, it's the opposite. They promote hate and racism because they attack anyone and accuse anyone of anti-Semitism who is who's sticking up for Palestinian rights or criticizing a genocide. So, and which is disgusting in many, many ways, obviously, but it's disgusting because that they're basically trying to dampen down criticism of a genocide. But secondly, they're also making anti-Semitism much worse because they're muddying the waters. So people here, after relentless years of weaponization of anti-Semitism, particularly against Jeremy Corbyn, a lot of people switch off now when they hear anti-Semitism, which is not a good thing because anti-Semitism is real and it needs to be fought like all racism. But they don't care about that. They don't care that they're making it much harder to fight anti-Semitism. They're just weaponizing it to destroy critics of Israel. So that is a very, very powerful disciplining tool in our political system because people are scared to talk out about Israel because people don't want to be called an anti-Semite. And also they can just run character assassination programs, which they did in Jeremy Corbyn's case. So it means that no politician can rise up to the level of power, essentially, if they have a pro-Palestinian position. So that's another element. Keep holding our government basically in place as a supporter of Israel. I mean, it became very clear during the Corbyn years, but also before that, there was a documentary by Al Jazeera called "The Israel Lobby." I don't know if you've seen it. It's a brilliant piece of investigative journalism about the Israel lobby in the UK, and they went undercover, and they had like a Israeli diplomat called Shai Masok. They recorded him privately saying, "We're going to take down a UK government minister called Alan Duncan because he had a moderate position on Palestine." This is a guy that wasn't even radical in any sense on this issue. He said he supports a two-state solution, which is the official government position. But they were like, we're going to take him down because that's not allowed. And then his diaries came out afterwards, and he said that he was going to be made Middle East minister in 2016, and it went up to the Prime Minister Theresa May, and she was called by Conservative Friends of Israel, this Israel lobby group, and they said, no, you can't do that, and she didn't do it. So there you have, in a very, very, very clear way, the Israel lobby, which is working in alliance with the Israeli state, overruling the democratically elected Prime Minister of Britain. So that, to me, all this evidence shows that the Israel lobby is the deciding factor and the reason there's such undying support. This is also a theory which is supported by a very, very esteemed political analyst called John Mearsheimer, who wrote a book with Stephen Walt about, I don't know, 20 years ago maybe, called The Israel Lobby, where he laid out this thesis as well, because he's a realist. He's not a leftist in any sense. He's just like, we need to work in US national interests, and the point is we can't work on the US national interests on Israel Palestine because our political system has been captured by the Israel lobby. And I have to say, all the work I've done has made me align with that theory more than but it's again, it's crumbling, because part of the reason that it's become so overblown and so powerful, the Israel lobby, is because people don't want to talk about it because it feeds into what we're told are anti-Semitic tropes. But that, again, is rubbish, because all foreign countries have lobbies in this country and the United States, particularly the United States, because they want to manipulate US policy. But they're of differing powers. And Israel is very, very, very powerful. It's just a fact. It's not a trope. It's a fact, and they need to be exposed. And actually, one thing of the work we've done is, when you do start exposing it, you get less pushback than you think you would, because part of it is that there's this idea that the Israel lobby and Israel is omnipotent and omniscient, but actually, what those Israel lobby groups have described, like Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel, what they're doing is unjustifiable. Like, it is not justified that you can cultivate a political class in the service of a apartheid and now a genocidal state. It's also not justified that you can take all our politicians, well, not all of them, but a lot of them, to Israel and pay for them to go, and you're not telling us who funds you. That's a fundamental contradiction, and shouldn't be allowed in any system that calls itself a democracy, that you can have pressure groups that don't reveal their funders taking your politicians on jollies to countries. So and it has changed, and you can talk about it more than you used to be able to. So so to answer your question directly, yes, I think it's more the Israel lobby. I think that the other point is, I would always say is, look at the Middle East. Do we really need a country that's smaller than Wales there, when we own Egypt? All the Gulf states are basically satrap regimes that work for the empire. Do we need this little aircraft carrier when we have a huge base in the biggest US base in the region is in Qatar? They have bases in Bahrain, Saudi, everywhere. Like that, it's not like that part of the world is out of control. Lebanon is effectively a client state. They obviously don't control Iran and Syria, but I don't think that. I think that they basically, our government is not making decisions based on the UK national interests, and the same in the US. They're making it based on Israeli national interests. And there was a quote actually from the diaries. I mentioned this guy Alan Duncan, who this Israeli diplomat said he wanted to take down. There's a quote in his book, his diaries, where he says, "The Israelis think they control the Foreign Office, and they do." And he was a foreign minister, so he's saying explicitly. So for him, and interestingly, he was recently the subject of an investigation for anti-Semitism. So there you go.
Yeah.
It again goes to that other side of it, which is just smearing any opponent as a anti-Semite to stop them speaking out. So it's a system which we have to take on if we want to have justice in Palestine, because it's so central to the fact that our governments are going against the will of their own people, which is, in the UK context, a majority want a ceasefire and a majority want an arms embargo. I'll just finish with this. Actually, there is an important example of why I think that the lobby is the overriding factor as well, which is that in 1982 in this country, Margaret Thatcher, who's not someone who would probably align with our politics, in fact, definitely wouldn't align with our politics.
Definitely not. Yeah.
Yeah, she was extremely evil, but she enacted a complete arms embargo on Israel in 1982 after the invasion of Lebanon.
Yeah.
That's unthinkable now. And I don't think that's because Israel has become more important to our national interests, or having this little colony has become more important for our foreign policy. I think that's because that would never happen now, because the Israel lobby's power has grown so much since that time that it would be impossible for politicians to take that decision, because she's in her politics would have been much more pro-Israel or pro-imperialism than the Labour Party should have been. But so I think, that's my answer.
Yeah, that's a very interesting debate, I would say. You really have people from two different schools. I had a guest on Moin Rabbani, and he is a Dutch Palestinian who is doing a lot of interviews as well. And he was convinced that it was not the tail wagging the dog. He was convinced that everything's happening because the U.S. Wants this. And then you have another school of thought that thinks it's more of the tail wagging the dog, like Mersheimer and yourself.
Yeah.
And I must say, I'm still not sure. I think both arguments are very convincing.
Yeah. I mean, do you know what? As I say, it's mostly just from the work I've done. I've just seen the power of the lobby, and it's just when you have lobby groups calling up a prime minister and overruling her decision about who to make minister. I mean, that's cast iron evidence that basically they're making decisions not our prime minister. But yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm not saying I'm not 100%. I'm just basing it on what I've done. But there's a lot of people I respect, like Moin Rabbani and others who have a different take. But yeah, I just can't see now what Israel would have to do for our governments to speak out against them in the UK and the US.
Yep.
There's nothing worse they could do. I think
Yep.
even if they started rounding up Palestinians and putting them into gas chambers, they would make the argument, well, these are all Hamas or something, that they would excuse anything.
Absolutely.
I said this on Twitter the other day. I was like, if Israel invaded the US and the UK, our political class would probably initially excuse it and then end up supporting it.
Yeah,
and I said it as a joke,
especially if it's the minorities. They're rounding up Western Muslims.
Yeah, exactly.
Our governments would agree.
Yeah, so our own governments wouldn't even defend our own country's territory against these people. So, which is an absurd situation, and I don't think can be just explained by geopolitical interests. I think that there's a power that has grown because people are so scared to talk about it. That is just it has taken on outsized proportions and made it impossible to move against. And Jeremy Corbyn was actually an interesting example, because he was the first pro-Palestinian leader of the Labour Party, basically ever, since the Second World War. Michael Foot was another sort of anti-imperialist leader in the 80s, but he didn't really speak much about Palestine. Corbyn had a long history of supporting the Palestinian cause. And when he was elected in 2015, it completely freaked out the Israel lobby. But then what happened? He was effectively destroyed by a smear campaign, an anti-Semitism smear
Even
campaign.
The Guardian jumped in full.
Yeah, The Guardian led it in many ways, and that was that. But that's a disciplining tactic. That will happen again to anyone who gets anywhere near power. So that's what I mean about it. Any leader not being able to rise up to take on Israel in this country because of all these assets that are activated to try and destroy them and paint them as an anti-Semite. But yeah, I have to say I do come down on the lobby side now. But
yeah. No, go ahead. You want to say something?
No. But I do understand that it's complicated and probably is a confluence of different factors. They're not I just don't understand how someone like Biden has done what he's done, because even now he's a lame duck president, right? And you would think in that context, when there's a UN Security Council vote and on a ceasefire, which happened this week, all 14 members voted for it, including the UK even. The little lapdog voted for it, and Biden was the sole veto. The US was the sole veto. How that's really detrimental to the image of the United States in the world. And he doesn't have any reason to do it now.
No.
So why is he doing it? I think that's only explained by the fact that the political system is so infiltrated by people who are working to manipulate it in the service of Israel that it's impossible for him to go against it now, and impossible for any president. And if you look at what Trump's doing, I mean, all his picks are like just off the scale,
Yeah.
crazy Zionists who want to annex the West Bank and probably Gaza too. So, yeah.
Yeah, tattooed crusaders in his cabinet and all that
Oh
kind of
yeah,
stuff.
Hegseth. Yeah,
So let's see what's going to happen.
yeah.
Matt, we're already at the hour, so I could talk many more hours. But can I ask you one more question
Sure.
before we go? So you exposed with your Declassified UK that the UK actually has played a significant role in the genocide in Gaza. I think what you have done and exposed is so exceptionally important because so many people in Europe in general, not just in the UK, but in Europe in general, are completely unaware of the foreign policies of our governments. To give you an example about my case, I saw that was, I think, before the genocide, actually, a little show by The Cradle. It's a journalistic outlet from Lebanon, actually telling about Dutch commandos being caught in Lebanon with their weapons and everything by Hezbollah. And I can tell you, nobody in our country has any idea what we're doing in the outside world, like being a cog in the US-led imperialist system. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So what you are doing, and I think many more countries should have outlets like you, Germany, the Netherlands, France, you name it, is so exceptionally important. And my question is, can you tell us in the time that you still have for us now, what are the major findings with regards to the UK's involvement in the Gaza genocide, or I should say Palestinian genocide even, and are there any new developments?
Yeah, well, I would say that the UK role is huge, and this is a tripartite genocide. Essentially, it's the US, UK, Israel, Germany as well, but that's mainly arms. Like the UK role, and not many people understand this because it's not arms that is the main way we contribute. If you look at the breakdown of arms to Israel, it's like 60-70% US, 20% Germany, and then 10% between all the rest of the countries. So the UK is not that important. We do produce 15% of the F-35, which is using to pummel Lebanon and Gaza, which wasn't included in the recent arms suspensions, by the way, purposefully. But there's a lot. When there is focus on the UK role here, it's always about arms. But what the work I did and Declassified UK did was basically showing that we are the main intelligence ally, effectively. And this goes, there's two ways this happens. One was there was a leak in the New York Times this summer, which showed that a British spy squad had been deployed inside Israel early on in the genocide to help them with their Gaza operations. And the Israeli official who leaked it to the New York Times said that the UK intelligence gives value added, that's the quote, and provides intelligence we can't get on our own. So, and interestingly, to go to your point about the media, not one UK paper has ever mentioned that spy squad, even though it was leaked to the New York Times. It's a complete blackout. Add to that, in December 2023, so a few months after October 7th, the UK started sending a Shadow R1 spy plane over Gaza every day for 6 hours. Some days two planes, so 12 hours of footage. And that was sent from our base on Cyprus, which I'll talk about a bit later on. But again, no one in the UK media was interested in what those spy flights were doing, or where they were going from, or how long they were in it, or how many there were. So I did all that work looking at what the intelligence was, and it's crazy. The Shadow R1, one of its capabilities is target acquisition. Now, the UK government told us that oh, it's just about hostage rescue, but that doesn't explain how you have like 1,500 hours of footage, probably more now, from Gaza that you're giving to the Israelis just for hostage rescue, when we have one hostage in Gaza, and at that point only had two. One was actually probably killed by the Israelis. So that's not explained. And the other point is, when they say it's only for hostage rescue, if you look at how the Israeli government present their genocidal campaign in Gaza, they always say it's about hostage rescue. So you could basically say any operation that Israel does is about hostage rescue. So it's semantics, in my opinion. But again, no investigation at all of where that intelligence is going, what it's doing. There was a question asked in Parliament recently, actually, by a Liberal Democrat here, where he said, "Can you tell me, is the UK passing intelligence to Israel for the purposes of military targeting?" And the minister who replied, the Labour minister, refused to say whether they were. So you can take what you want from that. But the point is that we're the ones sending this plane, a spy plane over Gaza every day. It's not the Americans. It's not anyone else. It's Britain. And that's our role. We're the ones sending this spy squad inside Israel. We're the ones who deployed our special forces, the SAS, to Cyprus on October 27th. It was again leaked to the Sun newspaper that the SAS had deployed to Cyprus for Gaza operations. And the 28th of October, a D notice was sent to every media editor to say don't publish any more information about the SAS. A D notice is a request sent by the Ministry of Defence to the media not to publish any information. Every media outlet in Britain has acceded to that D notice. We don't know any information about what the special forces have done since they were deployed to Cyprus for Gaza operations. They could have been on the ground in Gaza. They could have been advising the Israelis on their campaign, which is probably more likely. But again, no inquiry at all from the media. No, they didn't even publicize the D notice. We only know about the D notice because a small newspaper got it. A small newspaper called the Socialist Worker got it and publicized it. And then so it's a huge. So we are basically in the intelligence partner. And then there's a huge logistics role as well, because I did a lot of work on our base on Cyprus before the genocide, but I started looking into it afterwards. And just for your viewers to explain a little bit, after independence in 1960, Cyprus was a British colony. It got independence in 1960, but we retained 3% of the landmass of Cyprus. And we turned the western part into a massive airbase called RAF Akrotiri, the eastern part, Declassified, into a huge intelligence station. Both of them are effectively joint bases with the United States. Not officially, but if you look into it, they are. But it became clear quite early on in the genocide that was the key logistical hub for getting weapons, international forces, spies, logistical equipment to Israel. Everything was going through RAF Akrotiri. And actually, one of the things I found early on was that the Dutch special forces had also deployed to Cyprus, to that base, as well as German, and as I said, the British as well. But I found straight away that like we were sending daily massive cargo flights. They're called C-17s and A-400s, the two planes that were going to Israel every day soon after October 7th. Again, no inquiry from the mainstream media. When we asked the Ministry of Defence, they said, well, mostly they're to do with medical supplies and moving ministers. And you're like, there's a couple of ministers that went to Israel, but you're talking about there were over 30 in the first couple of months that had gone. So we still don't know what was on those flights. That carried on. Then you had Israeli military planes landing in Britain. Again, no media interest at all. I published a story revealing that they'd landed on 4 sites. The government then changed position and had to reveal that 9 had landed by, I think, April. So, and we don't know what was on those flights. Again, you're not allowed to ask. In fact, the funny thing was, when I say you're not allowed to ask, I say that on purpose, because there was a brilliant MP called Kenny McCaskill who was representing East Lothian constituency for Alba, which is the Scottish Nationalist Party. He was the only MP who was basically trying to prize information from the government. And there was one time he asked a question about RAF Akrotiri, and they said to him, the Ministry of Defence is refusing to answer any questions on RAF Akrotiri. They didn't even let him ask the question and say we won't answer because of national security reasons. They said you can't even ask the question in Parliament. So there was it was clear that there's a massive cover-up going on. They knew RAF Akrotiri, they knew our bases in Cyprus were being used as a central hub, and they didn't want anyone to know about it. I think partly because they knew that British ministers would be are complicit in war crimes, and this is why they should all be sweating profusely today. Because if you look at what happened yesterday with the ICC arrest warrants, British ministers have been participating through this intelligence and logistics role the whole time, effectively. And in fact, I found that Keir Starmer had sent one of these spy planes that I mentioned that started in December. He sent hours after that ICC arrest warrant was issued for Netanyahu and Gallant, a British spy plane went over Gaza for Israel. So, and that intelligence was going to Israel. So we're not just complicit; we're participating. So,
and remember when he also said that they have the right to starve and all that stuff.
Yes, exactly. I mean, but it's Starmer, John Healey, who's the Secretary of Defence, David Lammy, the previous government, Rishi Sunak, Grant Shapps, who was Defence Secretary, James Heappey, who was another Defence Minister. All these people should be investigated and taken to The Hague. And if you're arresting or sending out arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, you should be arresting or at least putting out warrants for their accomplices. And they knew what was going on. You know, some of the stuff that they're being indicted for. So Gallant's going out and saying we're dealing with human animals and advertising the fact he was going to use starvation as a weapon of war, which is a contravention of the Geneva Conventions. The British government knew all this. They're watching the TV as well. They can't claim they didn't know. So, and they still ratcheted up all this support and all this participation. So I think that part of the reason there was such secrecy and such a pushback against us trying to get information was because they knew they would be made complicit. And we know that the US is using the Cyprus base to send weapons to Israel, but they've never admitted it publicly. They always say we don't comment on allies' movements on our bases. But I think that there was one. Actually, we have to laugh when we can. There was one bit where Kenny McCaskill asked in Parliament, "Is the US using RAF Akrotiri to send weapons to Israel?" And they said, "We can't tell you because we don't comment on allies' actions on our bases." And then he said, so he sent another question saying, "Okay, you don't need to tell me if there's weapons on the planes. Just tell me this: are you aware of what is on the American planes when they land?" And they were like, "We can't answer that either." They can't even say whether they know what. So they're so scared of revealing their true role. And of course, they know what's on them because you can't. It's not sovereign territory, of course. So they don't want the world to know that they were using this Cyprus base as the main logistics hub to get weapons and whatever else to Israel. So hopefully, all this will come out. We need it to. And again, everything I've just told you, basically everything has been erased from the mainstream by the media. Like none of it has got in. And the irony is it's got into the Cypriot press. So the Cypriot prime minister president had to make a comment. The president of Northern Cyprus had to make a comment. The High Commission, the British High Commission in Nicosia, the capital of Cyprus, had to make a statement, all because of our work. There were protests at the bases. All this was happening. And nothing was being written in the UK media. It's amazing. It even surprised me. To go back to what you were saying about having been aware of all this stuff before Gaza, but still having a sort of awakening like me over Gaza. I've also had an awakening about the role of the UK media, which I knew was bad, and I knew about propaganda by omission. But I really this last year has just made me see it in a new light. I'm like, this is how they brainwash the public. It's just leaving out any information which is not conducive to power and power's narrative. Completely erased. And it doesn't matter if the president's talking about it. It doesn't matter if there's a massive demonstration at your base in Cyprus. We don't need to cover it because no one's gonna know, and no one's gonna read this little website that we don't care about. So that is how the system is sustained. We are brainwashed by our media just not giving us the information that we need to understand how our world works. And there's nothing more serious than your state participating and effectively committing genocide. And our media, that's why I believe the media is complicit, because if the media reported what we have reported at Declassified, there'll be so much pressure to ground those spy flights, to stop the use of RAF Akrotiri as a logistics hub for Israel. But because the media don't cover it, it's not an issue in the country, and that is why they are complicit. They're part of the Israeli genocidal war machine, and we need to change all that. We need to take advantage of the fact people are more awake than ever right now about the media, about the empire, about Zionism, about the Israel lobby. People's eyes have been opened over the past year, including ours. So we have an opening, and we have to use it to kick the door in and make sure that the think tanks, the institutes, the academics, all these imperial servants can't close that door again, because they're going to try, and we have to make sure they can't.
Very well said, Matt. And it reminds me, it really reminds me of the academic studies on terrorism. There is this not only in the media, but indeed also in academia. There is this imperialism gap when it comes to ourselves in the West. The rest of the world is imperialist.
Yeah.
Russia is imperialist, and you name it. But for example, when you read all these studies on Muslim terrorism, it was all about the what was it? The personality, the extremist personality, completely decontextualized from the fact, where does this come from? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what you're saying about the ICC, I also think that this may actually be a game changer, because it's the first Western, you could say, leader, even though it's that already calling them Western shows it's a colonial project. But it's the first Western leader that's being that you have an arrest warrant for a Western leader. I think they're sweating now all over the West. I really think they're sweating, and I think don't forget, Matt, we now also have a new generation coming up, and these are people who grew up with Twitter and X, and these are people who become lawyers later in life and whatever. And let's see what's going to happen, because I don't think that the leaders that we have now are going to have an easy time like Bush and Blair, to be very honest, with this new generation coming up. In my days, you still had a lot of people who were completely propagandized and just thought that Muslims were against our freedoms, and that's it. And Tony Blair just got away with being a devil and a monster.
Yeah.
But I think now we have a very different generation coming up. So that gives me hope.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that we're in new territory. Just the psychological barrier, this is a criminal, a war criminal, someone guilty of crimes against humanity, who has been working with all our leaders for a year to get the job done. So they can't escape that fact. And they're not even trying. That's the interesting. They're not even distancing themselves from him, really. They're basically just saying, well, Keir Starmer, his government basically said today, I think that they were ambiguous about whether they would enforce the arrest warrant. But I think it's a massive game changer, just psychologically, maybe not even in a legal sense, because I doubt whoever he actually stand trial like he should, because there's too many different obstacles to that. But just the psychological idea that maybe we could be war criminals too, maybe we could be imperialists, like you're saying. This is a tightly guarded psychological barrier that you're not allowed to cross, and it's been crossed, and there's no going back. Hopefully it will all unravel. That's what we need to do as academics, journalists, as dissidents. Just push on, I think I really do think that we have an opportunity now that we've never had. We've never had it. Even like you mentioned Blair, in this country, there was a sort of a movement to get him indicted for the Iraq War, and it never really went further than the left. Really, it was never really mainstream, but partly because I think people literally switched off when you said it, because because the psychological barrier was there. It's like, what? No, you can't. A white leader of Britain in the dock at The Hague. It's so preposterous to people that they couldn't even entertain a notion. So you can. But now there is an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, the ally of Keir Starmer and Joe Biden, who are both progressives apparently as well. That's the other point. It also shows up the two-party system. That's gonna take a long term a long time for us to understand the full consequences of the psychological impact of this, but I think it's good, and I think it will help us to unravel the whole tightly guarded secret, which is that yes, we're imperial powers and we don't care for human life. We care about projecting power and in this case supporting genocide and the destruction of a whole people.
Yep, absolutely. Well, on that note, I'm gonna end it here. You have already been very generous with your time, Matt.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent, was excellent, yeah. And keep your investigative journalism going. We keep following you, and again, Peter really wanted to talk to you as well. So we are gonna invite you again in the future.
Yeah, please. I'll be happy to. That was really fun. It was good.
Great.
We're on the same page.
Okay, right. Fantastic. Well, thanks for your time, and see you another time.
Yeah, have fun in Hong Kong. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. See you.